Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To the summit, can Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un start a meaningful peace process? As well as what's Italy's democratic process means for the EU, and much, much more on this edition of Crosstalk. Cross-talking the summit, I'm joined by my guest, Mark Sloboda. He's an international affairs and security analyst. We also have Dmitry Babich. He's a political analyst with Sputnik International. And in London, we cross to Alexander McCurris. He is a writer on legal affairs as well as editor-in-chief of the Duran.com. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Let me go to London first. Let me go to Alex. Let's do a quick update on what's going on the Korean Peninsula. This time last week, Trump had said no. Now he says yes. What I think is in play is really the inter-Korean dynamic here. This is where the real peace process, if there is one, going to be one, it originated there, and it's going to continue there, and we're going to have to see where the U.S. stands. But even if the U.S. does change its mind once more, it doesn't mean a peace process is over. Go ahead, Alex, in London.
I think that is absolutely right. And I think you are correct to point out that this actually started as an inter-Korean dialogue. The Koreans first started to talk to each other properly back in January when Kim Jong-un basically made a speech, a New Year address. He said, let's go to the Olympic Games, and we've seen this thing take off. Now, I also think you're absolutely right to say that it is the United States which is being pulled along. There are some people in the United States who I think are not happy with this process, but ultimately, what can the US do if South Korea agrees to North Korea agrees to disarm, to get rid of its nuclear weapons, and South Korea says the US troops must go? Does the US say no to those two things? Well, I think some people would like it to. But it might not be easy.
You know, what I think is really interesting, let me go to Dima here. I mean, you know, in looking at the mainstream media, it is the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, not North Korea only. Yes. Also, the North Korean leadership has made it clear, very wisely from a diplomatic point of view, is that they're not demanding a complete, immediate withdrawal of American troops. That would be part of some kind of process here. I mean, they are displaying a step-by-step process. Donald Trump, through his last utterances about it, seems to be picking a deal made in one meeting. Smart, okay, because there won't be. On top of it, we have an international charm offensive going on. You usually don't say North Korean charm, but now we are meeting with President Putin. So this is having a ripple effect.
Well, I mean, it's very easy to out-charm the United States because
these days.
Michael Pence said that developments in North Korea could go along the Libyan model. You know, we all remember what happened to Libya and what's going on there now. It's not a very appealing perspective. But, you know, the way Trump handles it, on the 13th of June, you know, one day after the presumed summit, South Korea has local elections and they have midterm elections to the parliament. So it's very important for President Moon Jae-in, who did a lot for peace on the peninsula, to come to this election with some kind of a result.
Well, he's already, I mean, there's already results. This is all about a process. Mark, there's still a lot of landmines in going to, and I want to say there's nothing wrong with being cautiously optimistic, but we do see the path, okay? Including the United States the last time this happened.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with being cautiously optimistic, but I'm not at all. I'm not optimistic, cautious or not. I mean, the landmines are so huge. I mean, just the fact that the two Koreas are speaking to each other is already a progress that I and we should have we should lower our expectations. I mean, we have figures in the administration. We have Bolton, we have Pompeo, we have Pence and others. Right? We have the U.S. deep state. We have Japan, which does not want to see the two Koreas unified as it has historical animosities with Cuba. We have the South Korean deep state because they have a conservative military and intelligence apparatus which is not very happy president, right, and some of the gestures he's. Remember that just a few weeks ago when the U.S. pushed defense drills with Korea that was going to involve strategic assets, including B-52 F-20 bombers and F-22 fighters, both nuclear capable, that already almost sunk these talks. So it would take a very small military provocation, and it's not like we haven't seen those before.
Exactly.
Right, to not only sink this, but to send us in the other direction.
Let me go back to London to Alex here. But one of the things that is, okay, I'll take Mark's, he's not cautiously optimistic, and I think that balances us all out on this program here. But, bringing the Russians on board, the Chinese on board, certainly elements of the South Korean political leadership, I agree with Mark, there's going to be the deep state that's going to be very hesitant. But this is creating a momentum, and anyone that's involved in negotiations, and particularly Donald Trump with the art of the deal, no one wants to have the perception out there that they didn't follow through. And I think this is part of the dynamic that is being played out right now. Go ahead, Alex.
Well, talking about momentum, let's talk about this off-on summit. The deep state, people like Bolton, deliberately tried to sabotage the Kim-Trump summit. That was why they were bringing up this business about Libya. That was why all those drills happened. And yet, in spite of all of that, in spite of Trump saying the summit is called off, the summit is back on. And the reason it is back on is because the Koreans, the two Koreas, responded by talking to each other. And that is the momentum. But Mark is absolutely right. There are all sorts of people who don't like this. Japan might want to go along with this eventually, but it is not going to be happy to have an 80 million population Korea economic giant, an arrival on its doorstep. And if one has been to Korea, South Korea, which I have, there is no love lost between Koreans and Japanese.
Oh, none. But I think I'm going to change gears here. But at the end of the day, it's all about country sovereignty. South Korea maybe want to claw some of it back, and Japan will have to think about its dependence on the United States if the deal is made. All right, let's change gears here. Dima, I was watching the Italian elections with great fascination. Essentially, the powers that be were putting a brake on democracy. The two parties that won more than 50% of the vote, and then they backtracked here. And now we have the EU first lecturing many figures in the EU lecturing the Italians about how they should vote. But the democratic process is inching ever so slowly forward in Italy. What kind of message is that sending Brussels and the rest of the membership of the EU?
Well, I think the message is don't trust the mainstream media who calls anyone who disagrees with the European Commission populists, far-right, dangerous, marginalized politicians. The Five-Star, and the Northern League, they have won together, if we add their percentage of the vote, they won more than 50% of the vote of the people who actually came to the polls. They had the full right to suggest their prime minister. When the president, Sergio Mattarella, tried to sabotage it, that was a scandal. But obviously there are some changes taking place in the EU, because I think 2 years ago, 3 years ago, the European Commission would simply, push their idea through, because the Northern League and the Five-Star committed a mortal sin. They called for an end to anti-Russia sanctions in their so-called government contract. But now, when the head of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, or Juncker in French, when he is saying, I'm quoting this, I do think we have to reconnect with Russia, not forgetting what our differences are, but the Russia bashing has to be brought to an end. End of quote. When such things you hear from the head of the European Commission, something has to change inside the European Union too.
Mark, I think maybe, again, cautiously optimistic, is that there may be the awareness that it's not the rise of the populist left, it's not the rise of the populist left and right. But it's really the failure of the center, of these centrist parties. And are they going to get on board and understand that people are going to vote for alternatives?
So I don't think you understand the danger that this populist democracy presents to the European Union finances.
I feel like you're lecturing us all now, Mark.
Well, we don't have to lecture because thankfully the Italian figurehead president rightly recognized that the euro is greater than democracy, right, and acted to defend it by preventing this this joint far-right, far-left government's finance minister, who was very critical of the euro, from being appointed. The EU's budget chief, I think, said it best, Gunther Oettinger. He says it is unacceptable for Italians to vote for populists. The markets will teach them how to vote.
Okay, Alexander, react to that, because I think that was really the best quote of them all. But you know, it gets down to either you promote and work through the process of democracy, or you don't. And in this case, we had glaring polar examples of one or the other. Go ahead.
Why have these two parties, the Five Star Movement and the Northern League, now become the dominant parties in Italy? They've become the dominant parties in Italy because the mainstream parties in Italy, the Democratic Party, the former Communist Party, by the way, some people might be interested to know, became essentially transmission belts for the orders they were getting from Frankfurt and Berlin and Brussels. They were no longer responding to Italian electorates. They were responding to what they were being told to do from the EU centre. Now, given that this has failed in Italy, we've had 20 years of economic recession and stagnation there. Yeah. We have 35% unemployment amongst young people. We have had lower living standards. It is understandable.
Okay, Alex, I'm going to jump in here. Gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on real news. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. Okay, Dima, I want to go back to the Italy-EU story here. I want to, on the tail end of what Alexander Makiris had to say in London. All of this is going on with a looming trade war with the United States, so add that into the mix.
There is a big split in the EU on economic matters, particularly on the so-called Nord Stream, you know, the gas from Russia going to Europe, and it's exactly the same kind of split that we have on the attitude of the EU to Trump's pull-out from the Iran deal. Poland and some other East European states, they're for the Iranian pullout. They want to protect Trump from criticism from the EU, and they're against the Nord Stream project. And what is very interesting is the cynical attitude of the United States. I mean, the spokeswoman for the State Department, Sandra Oudkik, denied, I'm quoting, the malicious rumor according to which the U.S. only opposed the pipeline in order to sell gas to Europe. Well, it's not a malicious rumor.
It's not practically true.
It's the same kind of a malicious rumor that we heard about Iraq not having weapons of mass destruction before the American invasion, or about the Russian journalist Babchenko being actually resurrected.
Okay, we're going to get to that story. Okay, since you brought it up, Mark, in a nutshell, explain this resurrection of a Russian journalist in Ukraine who's anti-Russian.
Yes.
Okay, I think I got that right. Go ahead.
So this journalist, opposition activist, Arkady Babchenko, he's a veteran of the Chechen War. He tried
on the Russian side.
On the Russian side, he tried to get out of military duty by claiming mental illness. In fact, he got caught bribing a doctor to claim he was mentally ill. He ended up not serving when his parents broke into his commander's office and threatened to chain himself to the radiator. Then he volunteered to go back to the Second Chechen War as a contract soldier. Then he became anti-war. Then he became anti-Russian government. And this is a guy who really has no love for his country, and the country doesn't have much love for him. He celebrated the death of children in a fire in Kerma recently, saying "burn, burn." He celebrated the death of a Red Army choir and journalists that were en route to Syria for a performance, saying they were as guilty as Putin. And he posted on social media that he promised to come back to Russia on the first NATO tank coming into Moscow. So this guy is quite a character.
Okay, let me Dima, can you bring us up to the present here? I mean, this whole scam here. I mean, the reason why I'm interested in this story. I'm not interested in this guy at all. Okay, but
he's a character.
Well, he's a character. I mean, Hollywood stuff here. But the Western journalists, exactly how they reacted to this. They took it as gospel from the government in Kiev that the Russians are behind it. There's not any evidence whatsoever that is the case.
Let me tell you that he is the most famous Russian journalist living now in Ukraine, and he has been before that story happened, because he also covered the Donbas war from the Ukrainian side. He was with the Ukrainian soldiers bombing Donetsk.
He's now employed by ATR, which is funded by the U.S. State Department.
Absolutely. And Russia is such a totalitarian...
Through the American embassy.
Russia, is such a totalitarian country. After bombing Donbas, he returned to Russia, lived here for 3 years, and only left again for Ukraine in 2017, in the end of 2017. So when the news came that his body was found by his wife right next to his apartment after 3 shots, of course, all the officials in Ukraine and in the West, with the notable exception of President Poroshenko himself, started saying that they're sure it was Russia. Let me just quote the Ukrainian Prime Minister here. The Russian totalitarian machine didn't forgive Babchenko his honesty and his high principles. He was a true friend of Ukraine, which told the world truth about the Russian aggression. Well, if it's the same kind of truth that Babchenko spread about his death, then you can imagine what kind of truth the Ukrainian
well, that's the point. Let me go back to London, to Alexander. The story for me, the only importance of this story is the fact it shows that Western media will take anything, hook, line, and sinker, from the folks in Kiev that will paint Russia in a very negative light. And we do have the World Cup opening up in Russia very shortly. This is just another way to tarnish Russia's reputation. Go ahead, Alex.
Well, indeed, and if you actually look at the British, the media reaction when Babchenko turned up alive, there is a huge sense of betrayal and anger with Ukraine.
Surprise, surprise, surprise!
They're very angry because of the gift.
They damage this narrative. They expose this narrative as, in this case, a falsehood. And an awful lot of people are very upset and angry with Ukraine for doing that. That is one of the most remarkable things. People are saying, well, the terrible thing about this story is it's going to mean that Putin and the Kremlin propaganda machine are going to be able to exploit this to prove that other things...
I am certainly not exploiting anything. I'm just shining a light on this because that is the only antidote to this kind of propaganda here. Mark, go ahead, jump in.
Okay, so... this whole it obviously has some good planning here. The Ukrainian MP who was in on this said that it was done in the style of Sherlock Holmes, because Sherlock Holmes also did something like this, and it was very successful for him. I hate to tell it to this Rada MP, but Sherlock Holmes isn't a real character. I mean, he's fictional, right?
Criminals do it very often. Criminals fake their money.
We had a fake killer who actually used to be part of these Ukrainian ultra-nationalist battalions.
A fake victim.
A fake victim. The world's first verified crisis actor, right? Lazarus, returning just like the Skripals from the dead. I think they must have shot him with certified Novichok dummy blanks, only 10 times more powerful than VX, which means essentially harmless, right? supposedly the guy who hired this killer, they're saying, who has links to Russian intelligence, he says he's actually linked to Ukrainian counterintelligence. There may be a business angle because he is partner.
And somebody's a priest in all this.
In a German-Ukrainian venture to build sniper scopes for the Ukrainian intelligence services, and there's a disagreement over who owned this company. So some people say that it was all part of an elaborate corruption scam.
Don't you love our line of business? It's so entertaining.
It's so Ukrainian sorted.
Well, let me just put in a nutshell the reaction of the Western press to all of this affair. Babchenko is alive, but Putin still killed him. That is their reaction. And our great blogger, Patrick Armstrong from Canada, I think he found the most hilarious headline about this. The Babchenko stunt may end up feeding the Kremlin spin machine. So how Patrick Armstrong actually comments on that, I just love it. Those pesky Russians will use our lies to prove that we actually lie? This is impossible. This is unacceptable. But in fact, if you analyze the story, there is something in common that the Babchenko murder has with Trump-Russia collusion story. Both never happened. But there was a hysteric reaction, and the very well-oiled Cold War propaganda machine started working in the West, and now it just can't stop, you know. With Babchenko, it has to stop abruptly because of his resurrection. With Trump, it has to stop because there are no facts, but they can't stop.
Before we started this program, Dima, I was pointing out that you have newspaper clippings, and those are physical. You can save them. But in this day and age, people just wipe the internet clean. Okay, well, I want to change topics here. Alex, I want to go to you. An important story, it's not getting a lot of coverage, is that the U.S. wants to move an anti-missile defenses THAAD system into Europe, presumably because of the withdrawal of the United States from the Iran deal, that Iran is somehow a threat to Europe. This is very provocative behavior on the part of the U.S., considering Europe is staying with the deal with the Iranians. Go ahead, Alex.
Well, it is provocative, but it isn't surprising. And I think the point to make about anti-ballistic defenses and all the rest is that the United States has been driving these now for at least 20 years and is going to continue doing so and is looking for every opportunity to do so. And the primary country that they're directed against is Russia. That is, to me, irrefutably true.
You know, it's interesting because I don't see the security necessity, Mark, but these systems are very expensive, aren't they? I mean, someone's going to be cashing in on this.
Oh, they're extremely expensive, and I'm sure the Trump administration would try to get the German government to foot the bill. His constant complaints.
So you're going to say to the German government, you can't import your cars to the United States, your Mercedes-Benz, but you have to take
he's always lecturing them that they're not spending enough on their NATO spending to counter the Russian threat that is actually far closer to them. So the U.S. they're already putting these missile defense systems in Poland, Romania, Alaska, at sea, in South Korea. Now they want to put them in Germany. There's also talk about a new U.S. military base on the East Germany towards the border with Poland. The Polish government is now begging Trump. Yes. They want to pay Trump $2 billion for U.S. military forces to put a base in their country, while people around the world are protesting for the 1,000+ U.S. foreign military bases to leave their countries.
I lived in Poland for 10 years.
The Polish want the U.S. to occupy their country.
It is bizarre, their behavior. It's because everyone in Poland has an auntie in Chicago here. Now, let me go to Dima here. He's rapidly running out of time here. But one of the interesting things is that at the end of the Second World War, NATO was put into place to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out.
Exactly.
It seems that the Trump administration is doing everything possible to rearrange the countries, maybe to keep Germany down, but it's pushing the United States out. And we had Macron visiting St. Petersburg with quite a few overtures towards Vladimir Putin, even calling himself an equal to the Russian president.
Well, the problem is that a lot of anti-Russian resolutions, ideas, they're enshrined in the EU's documents.
Sure.
So it will take a long time for Europe to get rid of this pressure from the United States. But I hope Europe will sooner or later liberate itself, not by the European Union itself, but by some other form, you know, probably individually.
10 seconds, Mark.
Yeah. we have a further stretch. Colombia is asking to join NATO.
I forgot about this.
Right? This is another expansion. While Trump is preaching against NATO and saying that Europe isn't spending enough on NATO defense, Poland wants U.S. military bases, that in Germany. Now Colombia wants to join.
This is foreign policy follies. Gentlemen, we've
Organization.
run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Moscow and in London. This is the end of our broadcast segment. Stay with us for the extended version on our YouTube channel. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules. Colombia.